For me, behaviour photography is the purest form of nature photography. It's one that naturally allows us to create original images and create work that really stands out from the crowd. It's also a genre that really tests our skills. First of all, like any type of wildlife photography, we need to be able to find that wildlife. But we need to go on from that. We need to understand something about those species, understand the way they live their lives in order for us to photograph it. And thirdly, we need to ensure that our presence with those subjects is not an intrusion in their life if we want that natural behaviour to carry on for us to record it. My name is Alex Mustard and I'm an underwater photographer. Welcome to Nature Talks 2020. Right, let me shrink myself down. You don't need to see me big like this or dive. I'd like to just tell you a few words of introduction about me. I'm an underwater photographer, and that's work that takes me around the world, from cold water to warm water, from clear water to murky water, from blue water to green or brown water. And I enjoy that diversity that underwater photography allows. It puts me in front of some fantastic wildlife. And in fact, this was taken this year. It's hard to remember that we actually did overseas photography this year, but yes, back at the beginning of the year, I got myself to Cuba and was able to photograph this saltwater crocodile. But underwater photography for me is more than just nature photography. A lot of my photography involves photographing people underwater. And in fact, the most recent book that I've done is a book specifically about one shipwreck in the Red Sea, where this picture here was taken. And that sort of shows the diversity of what I do. I think to other underwater photographers, I'm probably best known for my book, Underwater Photography Masterclass, which is a book on the techniques of underwater photography. It was actually reprinted just 2 weeks after it was first published. It was very popular when it was released, and it sort of remained the most popular book on the subject. To nature photographers, I'm probably better known through the competition world. That's often where other nature photographers tend to see us underwater photographers cropping up in the results of major competitions. Back in 2013, I was the overall winner of the GDT European Wildlife Photographer of the Year, and that remains the only time an underwater photo has ever been the overall winner in that competition. And I'm also well known from the Wildlife Photographer of the Year, and I think I've now reached 14 different collection books of winners that have featured my photos, which is something I'm really proud of. Maintaining a long track record of success in competitions is a challenge, because I think when we break through in sort of the international nature photography world, our own vision, our own interpretation on subjects is fresh, and as a result it can appeal to the judges. But a couple of years down the line, most of those people have seen your shots, your style, your approach to photography, and soon work that was a couple of years ago considered really fresh and original soon loses that gloss, and your way of doing things is seen as a little bit, well, that was from a couple of years ago. That's one of the attractions for me in behaviour photography, is actually we're letting the animals do the hard work. The way they perform in our pictures really transforms and gives our images a freshness that allows them to keep appealing, whether it's to judges or to publishers. I don't want this talk to be specifically about competitions at all, but for those who are interested in that area, and I know a lot of photographers are, I have put in the corner of the pictures the logos from the competitions in which pictures were successful. I've just done that really to underline the fact that I think behaviour is a fantastic route to success in competitions. Even if competitions don't have specific behaviour categories, I think pictures with behaviour in really elevate themselves. So although my talk tonight is all about underwater behaviour, I hope that you see the value and the parallels in your own type of photography, whether it's underwater photography or not. I think behaviour makes pictures eye-catching because it gives them a natural narrative. There's a natural storytelling element to capturing an animal doing something that gives a picture additional interest. I think also these types of pictures have a strong appeal to publishers. They sell well because of that natural storytelling that's embedded in them. I think from a competition point of view, perhaps, it allows those of us who maybe don't always get ourselves in front of A-list celebrity, big animals, the chance to create images that really stand out a bit from the crowd. This is a tiny juvenile sweetlips, and this species actually dances for its protection. It pretends it's a tiny flatworm, and it wiggles through the water. And the closer the predators come to it, the more it gyrates. And that's what I was trying to show in this picture here. I think the final aspect is that when you capture behavior, there's that opportunity to endow our photographs with a decisive moment that gives the image visual power and makes it more appealing. And behavior, because there's something going on, gives you that opportunity that perhaps we don't always have in portraiture or photos of animals within their environment, or that sort of thing. And that for me is why I think behavior is really exciting. But this is the point of the thing, of the talk, where I have to raise my hand and make an admission. Yes, I'm Alex Mustard and I'm a sex addict. A sex addict in the underwater world, which I have to admit is by far the best place to be a sex addict, because sex is far more interesting underwater. If you are a nature photographer on land, you probably, you probably get the chance to photograph, if you're a mammal photographer, mammals mating. If you're a bird photographer, birds mating. But the behaviors are very, very samey. It's kind of the same thing over and over again. I'm not going to go into all the gory details right now. But the underwater world, it's very different from that, because we have so many different types of animals. Animals underwater have been evolving for about 1 billion years more than animals on land. And as a result, they've come up with some pretty interesting ways of doing it. But as a photographer, that opens really great possibilities to tell loads and loads of very different types of stories. Even relatively sort of more familiar animals to lots of you, like mammals, these are spinner dolphins. Even these are sort of getting up to something a little bit more unusual. The female here at the top, who was actually taking it in turns to mate with 2 different males as she was going on. We're already mixing it up a little bit. This one may look a little bit more normal. You can see 2 animals here, but you might be surprised when I tell you there are actually 2 males and 2 females busy doing stuff here, because this species, like quite a few underwater species, are hermaphrodites. So both of these species are both male and female. And when they mate, they take the opportunity to do it both ways for good measure. Other species gather together in large numbers for group behavior, whereas some species, and I'm sure no nature photographers can relate to this, prefer doing things on their own. Other species like to use their hands. Octopus mate by the male has a specially adapted arm that he uses to pass a bag of sperm to the female for her to fertilize her eggs. Whereas other species like to use their mouths. Mouth brooding is quite common in a number of groups of fish. And usually the eggs are kept inside the mouth. This male yellowhead jawfish is actually spitting out his bundle of eggs at this moment so that the eggs can be aerated, and usually he holds them inside his mouth when he's mouth brooding them. But you can see these are quite late stage eggs, because you can see the eyes on them. Don't worry though, I don't intend this to be a talk full of innuendo. It's very much a family friendly talk. This is my daughter here watching some marine life behavior. These are horseshoe crabs, and actually these crabs actually come right up to the border, the edge of the sea, to mate, and you can see them running down in the background behind her on the beach here. But I think when we want to get into any type of behavior photography, knowledge is absolutely king. It's certainly true in underwater photography. A lot of the time we dive with specialist nature guides. They show us great subjects, and a lot of underwater photographers just shoot what they're shown and don't necessarily understand what they're seeing. And I think that means that a lot of people miss out on shooting behavior because they're not really following what's going on. The key to shooting behavior is to learn those basic rules, learn how things normally work. And with mating behavior, it usually starts with males showing off. This is a male flame anthias showing off to a female behind him. Males actually seem to enjoy showing off to other males at least as much as showing off to females. These are 2 male cuttlefish, and these are in the UK, very busily displaying their stripes to each other. One of them's even actually gaped his eye open, so he looks even bigger and more impressive. And you can see the smaller female behind, who they seem far less interested in than each other. And even relatively cryptic species, this is a blue belly blenny, and actually this species, when it lives in its hole, just looks like a little brown fish, but it's actually got this great display chest for attracting females when it's mating time of year. Some species have very delicate, very beautiful, elegant mating dances. These are tiny Pontos pygmy seahorses, about 1 centimetre long, and they have a synchronized courtship dance that's very beautiful to watch if you can find them and allow them to this behavior to develop without disturbing them. In egg-laying species, there can be a need to build nests. This is a male fairy basslet, and he's pulled some algae from the seabed, which he's going to take back to his burrow, and he creates this bed of plants for the female to lay her eggs into. An unusual aspect of a lot of fish courtship is that the females need time to hydrate their eggs. The females are carrying the eggs all the time, but they're not massive and swollen. And so a lot of fish mating has quite a long courtship display section first, as the females hydrate their eggs and get ready to spawn them. And so there's a good opportunity for photography as males are busy showing off to the females and these eggs are hydrating. This picture here might be quite hard to spot the fish in it. These are painted frogfish. At the top there's an olive green female, and below there's kind of a pinky orangey male. And the male is nuzzling into the abdomen of the female, which is now beginning to really swell up with this massive ball of eggs as she's getting ready to spawn in the evening. I don't know how well you can spot them there, but you can maybe see her eye at the top and the big bulges in her belly. And those eggs, in a few minutes' time, she's going to swim out into open water and release them. And then, of course, it's the moment of mating. And that gives a great opportunity for that decisive moment shot. The best start that most fish can give to their offspring is to avoid them being eaten straight away by all the other fish that live nearby. So what most fish do is they race out away from where they live into open water and spawn there. This makes it quite a challenge for the photographer because they tend to do this very fast. And you also need to predict which way they're going to run so that they come into your shot rather than run away from it. But it gives the opportunity to catch this decisive moment. I also particularly like doing this type of photography with species that there's big differences between the males and the females. I think that makes the pictures visually more interesting. And also, actually, I think it's quite an interesting story is to show how these fish actually change sex during their lives. And in both these pictures, the smaller fish is the female and the bigger fish is a male, and he'd previously been a female. And when the dominant males die in a particular area, then females can grow up and take their place. But to be honest, I'm not that fussy. The opportunities to photograph fish spawning are actually quite few and far between. So when the opportunity comes around, I'll take on any species. Even these dwarf lionfish were interesting to see and photograph them spawning. And I think that's something that's really quite exciting as an underwater photographer. Is very little of this has ever been documented by scientists. And there's a huge number of species that you can really still get the very first picture of any of these behaviors. The reason that these fish race out into open water to release their eggs is most marine animals have a planktonic larval stage. What that means is after the eggs hatch and the young grow up, disperse and grow as part of the plankton, drifting in open water for anything from a few weeks to a couple of months. They grow and grow bigger, they disperse, and then they're ready to settle back down to the seabed as adults. This picture here actually shows a larval stage of a mantis shrimp surrounded by other plankton. And I think that drives a lot of this desire by the fish to get out and into open water to spawn. So understanding these aspects of their lifestyle can make you better at predicting what behaviors you're going to see. The other way that fish tend to spawn is by laying eggs down on the seabed, and particularly the smaller fish do this. I think it would probably be maybe too dangerous for them to race out into open water. And this gives a lot of different behaviors to photograph related to spawning, to egg carrying, to nest building, that sort of thing. And a number of species, both invertebrates like this emperor shrimp, you can see underneath its abdomen, it's full of eggs. It's a really big one, this one. A lot of species are carrying their eggs or just laying them where they live. This Wenteltrap snail produces poison or toxic eggs to be eaten. So it's really not too bothered about where it leaves them. And actually this one hasn't even bothered finishing feeding, and it's busy laying this big clutch of eggs behind it. You can see them above my head, the eggs, the yellow things. Laying eggs even down on the reef, though, can be dangerous. This photo here is probably a little bit hard to understand if you're not used to these species. But on the left-hand side is a type of sea slug with kind of wavy, we call them serrata, but on its back. And that one is laying a ribbon of little orangey eggs, which you can see sort of in the central top of the picture. But in the middle of laying eggs, it's actually been caught by a predatory species of sea slug that's actually eating it head first. And it's still laying eggs from its back end as it gets eaten by this other species of sea slug. I think the next essential skill in understanding our subjects is knowing when to look. It's particularly important as an underwater photographer because we can't stay underwater for any great length of time. We're limited by air supply, by depth, by temperature. It gets cold underwater. And as a result, we really need to plan very carefully the time we're going into the water if we want to catch certain behaviours. So in the tropics, there tends to be less of a season for spawning. It's warm year round, and a lot of the smaller reef fish spawn almost every single day, which gives you a great opportunity for photography. Yet relatives of those same species in temperate waters may only spawn once or twice during the year, and they have a very seasonal signal in that. These are dragonets. I photographed these in the UK. It's the only time this behaviour has been photographed of them mating. But the reason I was able to predict and get this shot, only having seen it once, is actually they spawn exactly the same way as their tropical cousins do. So having photographed their tropical cousins a lot, when I saw this behaviour developing, I knew exactly where it was going and was able to get the shots that I wanted. In temperate waters, a lot of the fish actually spawn at the end of winter because they want their eggs to be hatching at the time that the plankton is blooming. And the plankton tends to bloom spring into summer. So if you lay your eggs early spring, it gives time for them to develop, to hatch, and then when they drift off and join the plankton, there's lots of food for them to eat. So often it means braving the colder temperatures to capture these behaviours. This is a lump sucker, and here in the UK, these tend to spawn right at the end of winter, sort of February, March, April time is the time to see them when the water's right at its coldest. In sort of subtropical areas, the spawning tends to have much more of a season. And one of the things I find quite interesting is that these batfish in the Red Sea will spawn very clearly at the beginning of summer, whereas in more tropical areas, the same species spawns throughout the year. So the behaviors of individual species also vary place to place. And the more you follow these patterns, the more you learn to see the patterns, which helps you predict what's going on. Just because you heard that a species does something this way in one place doesn't necessarily mean it's going to do exactly the same thing somewhere else. Perhaps the hardest type of behavior shot to get are coral spawning, because a lot of the invertebrates underwater, and particularly corals, they spawn literally for just a few seconds every year in a very synchronized event. And so getting the timing exactly right for that is incredibly important. And those sort of decisions come long before planning to take your camera out. They're decisions you make when planning travel 2 or 3 years in advance to capture these particular events. Time of day also makes a difference. Generally, species that lay eggs on the seabed often do so in the mornings. It means that they have to spend less nights guarding their young. They have more daylight in which to guard their young when it's laid down on the seabed. Whereas species that spawn into the water column often spawn at the end of the day when there's perhaps maybe less hungry mouths in the plankton ready to hoover up eggs. So they're spawning at the end of the day. But irrespective of the reasons why they're spawning then, if you want to see sort of open water spawning, end of the day tends to be better. If you want to see egg laying, morning tends to be better. But and most of the corals tend to spawn at night. But as I was just about to say, there are as many exceptions to these rules as there are species following them. But it's important to have these things in your mind, because each time you're working with a new species, you have this chance. And as I was saying before, in the underwater world, the scientists are just, there isn't the funding for scientists to study all these things. So you can't just go and read about it in the literature, in the scientific literature, and get tips on how to see these things, because almost none of this stuff has ever been published or researched. As land mammals, one of the hardest things for us photographers to get our heads around about the way that marine animals or sea animals live their lives is how the sea affects their lives. And one of the big factors that affects the timing of everything in the oceans are the tides. The lunar cycle of tides is such a strong signal in the ocean that it determines when a lot of things happen. Most of the animals that are mating regularly through the year have clear peaks in activity around certain phases of the moon. But that does vary a great deal place to place and species to species. But the more you can study a species in one place, the more you'll see these things. In areas with really big, strong tides, big tidal ranges, strong tidal currents, you have a much more synchronized spawning event. These snappers here spawning in Palau, they spawn at a different time every day based on when the tides are turning. Whereas in other parts of the world, which have weaker tides, less strong tidal currents, this same species tends to spawn at exactly the same time of the day, irrespective of what the tide is doing. So these are patterns you need to get your head around if you want to see these sorts of behaviours. When starting out in behaviour photography, it makes sense to work with the easiest, most cooperative species. And generally that means egg layers, species that are laying their eggs on the seabed. This is a pair of fighting conch laying the big egg mass. Some species are a little bit more secretive about this, so you often need to be able to learn to search for them and look carefully, because particularly with a lot of the smaller species, it can be easy to miss these behaviours. And something I always sort of remind myself to do is to look for the behaviour when I discover the species. On the fish front, I think damselfish are the classic egg layers that we see, particularly on coral reef diving, but they live all the way through into temperate waters. And the reason we see them is they're the exhibitionists. They're really not bothered at all. They tend to carry on their behaviours however close we look. These are two females and a male laying eggs in this sea fan. However, I think, a relative of the damselfish that has a very different reaction to us are the anemone fish. And actually you see very, very few pictures of anemone fish mating. And finally, I sort of cracked the code as to why this was. And since then, I've been able to photograph them spawning lots of times. And the secret, it's no great secret, but the secret that's been stopping us getting lots of photos of this is that anemone fish have to leave the protection of their anemone to lay their eggs. And as a result, they're much more timid about it than damselfish are. And the moment that you approach them, they just go back inside the anemone and stop laying the eggs for a few minutes until you've moved away from them. It doesn't have any big effect on those, but it stops you getting the photos. What I've learned is that whenever I see an anemone fish with brand new eggs, and anemone fish eggs when they're new are strongly coloured, you can see that the clownfish here have got, if we point the right way, have got orangey eggs, whereas the guys on the other side, the white-tailed anemone fish, they've got red eggs. As both of those species, as those eggs get older, they'll get more and more silvery as the silvery eyes of the larvae of the babies develop. So whenever you see an anemone fish with brand new, brightly coloured eggs, just back away a little bit and see what develops. And that's been the key to me getting these spawning shots, is actually every time I saw an anemone fish with new eggs, I'd always thought, oh, they've just laid some new eggs, when actually they may still be in the process of laying. And then if you give them that chance, you'll get the chance for the photos. I think the reason that surprised us as photographers is once an anemone fish have laid those eggs, they can actually be very aggressive in defending them, and they'll actually swim out, a couple of meters from their anemone to attack you, even as a photographer, or other fish that might feed on their anemones. This is, but that gives us great chances for sort of follow-up photos. I think it's one of the things I like about egg-laying species is all this other behaviour to track as well. Egg guarding, which can give you the opportunity, because the fish are very confident, to try some much more artistic and different types of images of it. This is one of my favourites. And also there's a number of other behaviours to capture. There's some of the nurturing that goes on, the parental care, which I think is actually, as a fish photographer, really important, because people don't tend to associate fish with parental care. And the chance to get this into photos, I think, is really good for both people's opinion of fish and our portfolio. And they tend to use their pectoral fins like this to aerate the eggs. So they hover very close to the eggs and then push their fins like this to waft water across them. This is a behaviour that I'd never seen documented, but is really, really fascinating to me. Anemone fish can live in anemones because they rub themselves against the anemone fish's tentacles, and they cover their bodies in the mucus of the anemone, which stops the anemone realising that they're a foreign object and stinging them. And what we think is going on in this picture is the anemone fish has actually bitten one of the tentacles of the anemone and is actually rubbing the mucus from the anemone's tentacle all over its own eggs, so that the eggs aren't seen as something for the anemone to sting. Parental care is more common in freshwater, and I think that's something that's really nice to get into the pictures. Freshwater fish typically don't have the pelagic larval stage when the young go off and join the plankton. And as a result, it's more common to see parental care going right the way through to young fish. So it's quite common that fish, underwater might guard their eggs, but once the eggs hatch, they're on their own. They join the plankton again. Whereas in freshwater, particularly some of the larger fish like these cichlids, these are Mayan cichlids in Mexico, they'll actually guard their fry from being, eggs until they hatch to these clouds of fry, and actually even quite large, small little fish that look like juvenile adults, and that gives some really nice photographic opportunities. With egg-laying species, there is the opportunity to get them sort of looking after their eggs, and a number of species carry their eggs around with them, which gives some good opportunities for pictures. This is a leafy sea dragon, male leafy sea dragon, with these orangey eggs, if you can see them over there, if I point the right way, underneath his tail. And this is a weedy sea dragon. It's got sort of more sort of black metallic grey eggs underneath its tail. I think the places that fish guard their eggs can lead to really interesting photos, particularly mouth brooding, especially with species like this tiger cardinal fish, which has got really big teeth and looks really aggressive. I think that contrasts nicely with the parental care message. And a species that's well known for its parental care are seahorses, which actually the males have a true pregnancy. Female seahorses lay their unfertilized eggs into the pouch of the male, where the eggs are then fertilized, nourished, and grow up and are only released as small juveniles. They still tend to join the plankton for a few days to disperse a little bit, so they still have a planktonic stage, even though they're giving birth to live young that look like fully formed adults. The trouble, though, with any addiction is you always want more. And the step up from egg-laying species are egg-spawning species. That gives you this really dynamic behaviour, although it's often over in a flash, which makes photography much harder. Also, you don't tend to get a second chance. It's a bang and it's gone. Whereas egg-laying, takes 15, 20 minutes, even up to an hour. This is like that. So it puts the pressure on you much more as a photographer, especially when the fish are swimming as fast as they can. And anyone who's done bird in flight photography can imagine what the difficulties are of fish swimming at full speed photography when everything is underwater, and things like autofocus and that sort of thing work even less well than they do on land. This is perhaps my luckiest ever spawning photo. This is a pair of yellowtail surgeonfish spawning, and these fish spawn swimming as fast as they can. This is not a long exposure of this picture. I think it's shot at a 60th of a second or something like that. And the movement is simply just a reflection of how fast these fish were swimming. And it's a very, very lucky photo in that I was tracking these fish as they were spawning. I'd never got a photo of them spawning before. And this particular day, they decided to turn towards me right at the moment of spawning, when the two fish go belly to belly. And fortuitous for me, swim into focus as well and give me the opportunity to create this picture. My favourite pair spawning species, though, to shoot are the Hamlets. These are sort of delicate, exquisite little reef fish that have a fascinating biology. And there's a real great natural history story to tell with a group like this. And there are stories like this right across the underwater world, which is one of the things I love so much about being an underwater photographer. Loads and loads of people have been out there and photographed whales and sharks and turtles and all the big animals. But very few people have put that same amount of effort onto the smaller species, and there are so many amazing natural history stories to tell. And when it comes to Hamlets, their biology is truly fascinating. The first thing about Hamlets is that although a lot of fish change sex during their life, Hamlets are really interesting because they are simultaneous hermaphrodites, in that they're one of the few vertebrate species that remain fully active as males and females throughout their whole life. Good stuff there for us sex addicts. But that's not the end of their interesting biology, because the Hamlets, they're about, and on the reefs that they live, there are about 9 or 10 different species of Hamlets that are all classified on their different colours. But if you look at the genetics of Hamlets, actually all these species don't have any genetic differences. You can actually find 2 species of the same colour type of Hamlet on the same reef that are genetically more different than 2 different coloured Hamlets on opposite sides of the Caribbean. And the way that the scientists explain this is that they say that Hamlets are too recently evolved for these differences yet to permeate through the different species. They are really in the midst of evolution. And Hamlets preferentially will spawn with their same colour type. And each time they do this, they're driving the colour types to be more and more genetically different and to become more and more like independent species. And these are some of the different colour types of Hamlets spawning. Above me, those are indigo Hamlets. On the top corner on the other side, butter Hamlets. And below those are masked Hamlets. All the different types. And preferentially, they spawn like this. But sometimes we get hybrid spawnings where 2 different types of Hamlets spawn. A black Hamlet here and a yellow belly hamlet. And that's something really interesting for me, to see this. And obviously, every time this happens, they take a step back to being all just one species again, as the genetics gets all mixed up. And I think this is, why they're not really differentiating into genetically distinct species, even though they're these very clear color types. The nice thing about a hybrid spawning like this is you can really see that the two fish play the two sexual roles. When the fish is being a male, the male is the one that wraps its body around the female. So in this picture here, the black hamlet is behaving as a male, and the yellow hamlet is the female, the yellow belly hamlet. This picture here, taken about 4 or 5 minutes later, shows the yellow belly hamlet behaving like the male, wrapping its body around the black hamlet to create this behavior. After a while, though, as a sex addict, your addiction needs more feeding. And the only way up from pair spawning is group sex. And group sex actually is really exciting to photograph underwater because it can lead to some of the most spectacular aggregations of large species. And there's a whole host of things associated with that, particularly egg predation, because when so many fish are spawning, that's a real food source, and that can drag in some really exciting subjects as egg predators too. And many of my favourite pictures are taken around hunting out these spawning aggregations, where fish that spend most of the year usually living on their own gather together in these numbers for spawning and give you some really interesting photographic opportunities and behaviours associated with that. It's also a chance to see species that are very hard to see in other times. And I'm going to start with a not very sexy species, but a story that I was really fascinated to shoot. And that was to go and photograph cod. And cod used to be one of the most abundant vertebrates on the planet, certainly in terms of mass of animals. Right across the North Atlantic, seas were packed full of cod. However, over about the last 1500 years, us humans have become very, very good at catching cod. And as a result, cod numbers are very hard to see. And cod is a species you can, you put 100 divers together in a room and ask them who's seen cod. There'll be very few hands going up, despite this being a very well-known fish. And I was really keen to sort of change that and to try and get some photos of them that weren't, on a fishing boat, but were actually photos of them in the wild. And in order to do that with any reliability, I had to hunt out cod spawning aggregations and travelled up to the north coast of Iceland, where the aggregations there have been reasonably well protected. And it's a chance to dive back in time and actually see this species, which is quite a handsome fish with its sort of leopard spots and its very distinctive line running down its body. And cod are quite a big species as well. So they're quite fun to be in the water with, because some of them can be almost as long as you. And so they're really interesting to see. And by tracking down the aggregations, I was finally able to see this kind of image of what anyone who dives in the North Atlantic, the North Sea, will be used to diving in these kelp forests. But we're used to seeing these kelp forests devoid of big fish. And this is how they should look. And I think it's important to take pictures like that to remind people of how the oceans should be and how they could be again. And that was really my interest in following this particular spawning aggregation. Other marine fish actually travel back into freshwater to spawn, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with salmon. These are sockeye salmon, and I love the adaptations that they go to for their sex. They really go to great lengths. They put on costumes. They turn from silvery fish in the sea into these red and green beauties. They grow big spawning adaptations like this hook-like mouth of the male salmon. When they're coming up to defend and dig out their spawning reds. They gather in massive numbers, which is spectacular to see. It's an assault on the senses, to be honest, because as I'm about to reveal, after they spawn, they only get to do it once during their life, and after they spawn, they die. And I can assure you, all the rivers that you have to go in to photograph spawning salmon are not the sweetest smelling, and your camera afterwards stinks. Your wetsuit or your dry suit stinks for months afterwards. It's not a socially friendly. You don't want to sit next to a salmon photographer ever on a flight. But when things come together, you get the chance to capture these interesting behaviours of the male and the female salmon pairing up and spawning on their nest, and that's what this picture here is showing. After they spawn, salmon typically die. They just spawn once in their life and die. But actually, all this rotting biomass is very important for the next generation. The rotting bodies of the fish actually kickstart a whole food chain in the rivers that by the time these eggs hatch has generated a whole amount of new life that actually gives those young salmon food. So the adult fish aren't just providing the baby salmon a safe place to grow up. They're actually going on by dying to give them a food source too. I think though my favourite spawning aggregations occur in the ocean, and a real favourite of mine has been this species that I've been photographing for about 15 years now, and it's called the Boha snappers. And these are large predatory reef fish. They grow to 60, 70 centimetres long. And a paper that was published this month actually found an individual in the Indian Ocean from this species that was 79 years old. And so many of these are very long-lived fish, really fascinating to see. And their spawning aggregations give great opportunities for photography, seeing these interesting animals. And a species that usually lives on its own, this opportunity to find it. Typically they live on their own and they tend to stay living on the reef. But when they spawn, they gather in the blue. You get the opportunity to shoot them in a very different environment and surrounded by their peers, which I think gives some unique photographic opportunities. And the spawning behaviours are also spectacular, as these large fish spawn in small groups and fill the water with eggs and sperm. And it's the sperm that you can see in this picture. So you don't really want to think about that too much when you're swimming through it. But it does look spectacular in the water. And you definitely want to make sure you have a good shower, I guess, after these photographic sessions. But all that food in the water, particularly the eggs, is a real attractant to eggs, to species. It's a massive injection of protein into the water. And often what goes on after the spawning can be as fascinating as the spawning itself. These are another species of snappers, black snappers, that have come in and are filtering out all the eggs from the water, feeding. You can see them got their mouths open and they've just swum into the middle of the spawn there and they're just pumping the water through their mouths. And actually in some parts of the ocean, the reason we go after these spawning aggregations is not for the fish that spawn, but for the species that are drawn in to feed on their eggs. And actually the world's largest aggregation of whale sharks that we know about, where about 400 or 500 whale sharks gather together, is in Isla Mujeres in Mexico. And that aggregation follows skipjack tuna spawning. And I've never gone there to photograph the skipjack tunas. You go there to see the mobula rays, the manta rays, and particularly the whale sharks that are attracted to that food source. So I guess a talk on sex underwater needs a climax. And the climax of my talk is the biggest sex show in the world. And that is the mass synchronized spawning of corals on coral reefs, where the majority of the corals on the reef all spawn in a highly synchronized event, which lasts little more than half an hour in the whole year. And each individual coral is spawning really just for a few seconds within that half an hour. But as a lover of photographing this of sex behaviors underwater, this is definitely the pinnacle to see. And it's a relatively newly known phenomenon. When I was a kid, no one knew that corals spawned in this way. And around the world, there's still loads of places where we don't know when this happens. And to take these photos, I actually did the calculations myself, made the predictions, and was the first person ever to see coral spawning in the Cayman Islands, where I took these pictures. So that added a real excitement to it. Now, corals, like several of the species we've covered in the talk today, are hermaphrodites. And so these aren't actually their eggs that they're releasing here. These are bundles of gametes of eggs and sperm mixed together. And you can see, although the coral looks and feels like a stone, actually it's able to push a surprisingly large amount of matter in terms of gametes out of it when it does come to spawning time. And it is amazing how much material suddenly comes out of the reef. These things that basically look like rocks suddenly just give out so much life on this one mass spawning. And honestly, the ocean goes from being super clear tropical coral water to being an absolute pea soup of gametes. You really are swimming in a murky soup of eggs and sperm. But photographically, it is one of the wonders of the natural world, and I think a fantastic thing to photograph. So that's my final photo. I hope you've enjoyed this insight into the world of sex underwater. But I thought I'd answer the question that I would typically get asked when talking about these things is, have I ever been involved myself? And I'm pleased to say I've never voluntarily been involved myself in any of this. As a photographer, you try and keep a distance. However, there is some video evidence that I think I better show you involving this species here, where rather reluctantly I found myself a little bit too attractive to a dolphin. Okay, so this is, I guess, the downside of being such a gorgeous, irresistible underwater photographer, is that eventually there's going to be an animal out there that just can't resist you. Joking aside, I have to say, though, that this was actually quite a dangerous situation. Dolphins are pure muscle. Any animal that can jump sort of, 3 meters out of the ocean under its own power is a powerful animal. And this dolphin's as big as me and very persistent. And underwater, when you're wearing a face mask to see, a regulator to breathe through, all of that could easily have been knocked off by the dolphin just accidentally. And what is obviously quite funny to watch could have actually been very dangerous. I'm very grateful to my friend Michael who filmed that. That although he put it on YouTube, he did keep my surname out of it, and it's got a few million views on YouTube. But thankfully, it's not the most searched item that comes up when you look for my name. So that was a lucky thing for me. Anyway, I hope that talk has given you a nice insight into what it's like to be a behaviour photographer underwater. I hope there's some good lessons there for you to take on if you're an underwater photographer. But even if you're a nature photographer on land, I hope you see the value of incorporating natural behaviour into your photography, and how it's a great way to make your pictures really stand out and to give them the benefit of that natural enhancement that behavioural stories give them visually. Thank you very much. Thank you, Nature Talks, for hosting this, and see you all again next year.